When it comes to designing and building locomotives, logging railroads remain unmatched in the variety and uniqueness of their engines. This was mostly due to the unique circumstances each railroad faced, such as the geography of the land, how heavy the loads were, and how much money the line had to work with. Each railway usually came up with their own solutions, but for the bush tramways of New Zealand, the one solution they all seemed to have in common was just to add more wheels. Like many other countries in the late 19th century with a massive logging industry, New Zealand timber companies wanted a cheap and easy way to move logs. Most companies in America and Australia built tramways and temporary railways. However, the companies in New Zealand often didn't have the money to afford laying metal rails, especially if the tracks would only be temporary. As a result, many bush tramways used wooden rails in place of iron or steel ones, as not only were they significantly cheaper to build and dispose of, but could also be moved and relayed relatively easily. The biggest drawback with using wooden rails, however, was that they weren't as durable, nor could they carry the same weight as their metal counterparts. As a result, many of New Zealand's bush tramways still had to use horses or towing cables to pull wood trains along their lines, as the wooden rails couldn't support the weight of most conventional locomotives. Despite this, there was still a demand for locomotives that could work on these rails, and so several engineering companies stepped up to fill this niche. One of them being Johnston Sons. One of the locomotives they built, known as the Type A, was an 040 design weighing just 7 tons, featuring inside cylinders that drove an internal jackshaft to power its wheels. These engines were also fitted with broader wheels to allow them to run on both wooden and metal rails. 8 were built between 1896 and 1927, 4 being given tenders while the rest were simply operated as tank locomotives. Moore & Sons, who owned one of these engines, converted theirs to an 060 to help improve the engine's adhesion. Another type of engine Johnston built were the Type Bs in 1911, though these were built for use on steel rails, not wood. They were essentially pseudo-Shay locomotives, having an 0440 wheel arrangement and 2 cylinders mounted vertically on one side of the boiler driving a jackshaft connected to the engine's wheels. The boiler was even off-centered to counterbalance the weight of the cylinders, just like Shay engines. The main difference between the Type Bs and the Shays was that the jackshaft was located between the frames rather than on the outside. Only 2 of these were ever built. But the most bizarre and fascinating locomotives ever built by Johnston were their Type Ds. Certain wooden railways could only handle loads of 1 ton per axle, making it difficult to design a locomotive both light enough to run on the line and powerful enough to do the work needed of them. The Type Ds were designed to meet that demand in 1910. These engines were fitted with 16 driving wheels to help evenly disperse their 16¼ ton weight over the rails. The jackshaft that drove the wheels was set between the frames and used spur gears to transfer rotation from the shaft to the wheels. The shaft itself was powered by 2 vertical cylinders pointed downwards, mounted behind the boiler to help with weight distribution, and was also fitted to allow the engine to be geared up and down if needed. The end result looked more like a caterpillar than a conventional locomotive. Even with the additional gearing, these engines only ever managed a top speed of about 8 km an hour, and were known to quickly wear out the beveled gears that drove their wheels. Despite this, the design proved successful, with at least 16 being built between 1910 and 1927 by Johnston for use in sawmills and on wood-railed logging tramways. Johnston, however, wasn't the only company to build these caterpillar-esque engines, as in 1912, A&G Price Limited produced what was known as the Price 16-wheeler. It was essentially an identical copy of the Johnston design, with the main changes being it used different gears in its wheels and could negotiate tighter turns, but was much heavier than its counterpart. 4 of Price's 16-wheelers were built, with one working from 1912 all the way to 1951. Another similar design also came from G&D Davidson & Co. in 1916, this being known as the Heavy 12-wheeler. Unlike the previous designs, all the wheels of the engine were chain-driven as opposed to using gears and shafts, and was also relatively lightweight, allowing it to run on wooden rails, unlike the Price engines. It was also less of a copy of Johnston's design and more of an upgrade/refinement of previous engines built by Davidson's. Only 2 of these engines were ever built. For many bush tramways in New Zealand, it seemed that more wheels was simply the way to go for their engines. Obviously, these engines weren't without their flaws, only able to travel at very low speeds, requiring their gears be frequently replaced, and overall being more awkward in design compared to other contemporary geared locomotives like Shays and Climaxes. Despite this, these bizarre caterpillars, 16-wheelers, whatever you want to call them, were exactly the engines New Zealand's tramways needed. Just goes to remind us that no design is absurd if it works. Subscribe for more.